Hey guys, welcome back. We'll continue with Python crash course in the second part of the series. In the previous episode we covered how to install Python and also Sublime Text. In this part we're going to cover variables in Python and also strings, numbers and comments. We'll also learn about the Zen of Python. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel to get notified about any new videos, and if you find this helpful, please leave a like down below. Let's jump right into it. Last time we stopped right here. We created the print statement to print out this sentence here, which was printed here at the bottom. And now we're going to continue with variables and simple data types in the second part of the book. So what really happens when we actually run hello-world.py, the file we just looked at? So basically what's happening is once we execute that statement there, then we get the output. But actually our Python interpreter interprets what's happening in the background and allows us to print out that statement. So for example, the interpreter will see the word print over here, followed by the parentheses. And that means that the interpreter knows that print is actually a function or method to execute, and it will then execute the statement in here. So that string, that means that text inside of the quotation marks. So as we write our program, our text editor, Sublime Text, will highlight different parts of the program in different ways. So for example, print is highlighted in blue because it's a method, and the string itself is highlighted in green because it's a string. So instead we can use variables, and variables are basically a container that contains some data, and instead of directly referring to the data itself, we can just refer to the variable. So let's take a quick look at an example. So instead of printing out hello Python world, what we can do is we can define a variable, which we can just do by typing out the name, for example message, and then an equal sign followed by our actual string. So again we can write hello Python world, for example, and then instead of printing out our string directly, we can say print message. We can save that, and we can press Command B or Control B on Windows to actually run our code. And that still works as before. Now we just have an additional line here that we're dealing with. And this just means that our Python interpreter has one additional step to evaluate. Instead of just having that one line print followed by the string, we basically have to evaluate what's inside of message, what's being printed out. So when we are naming and using variables, there are a couple of rules that we need to follow. So variables can only contain letters, numbers and underscores. They can start with a letter or an underscore, but not with a number. Spaces are not allowed inside of variable names. So for example, we could not do this here. This would actually give us an error if we try to run that. As we can see right here, a syntax error. Python interpreter doesn't know how to handle that, so that's not allowed. Also, we should avoid using Python keywords as part of our variables. So we saw the keyword print before that we're using. We cannot use that as a variable name. Variable names should be short but descriptive. So for example, name is a good name for a variable. N would be less good because it's less descriptive. And of course, when we're using the lowercase l and the uppercase O, we should be careful not to confuse it with the numbers 1 and 0. So one thing we really have to pay attention to is to avoid name errors when using variables. So for instance, if we do the following, if we have our message defined here, and we then, for example, make a typo here, that we write message with 1s instead of 2s, and we are running this, we can see we get an error again. And we can see this is a name error because message with 1s is not defined. And the Python interpreter is looking at the exact spelling here. So if the name is actually identical to the name of the variable we defined. But it's not checking if it's spelled correctly or incorrectly. So what we could do is the following. We could just add that typo to the variable definition as well. And now if we run this again, you can see it's printing out our string here. So it doesn't really matter what we name it, but we need to be consistent when we refer to the variables that we defined. So variables are basically labels that we refer to, that we are referencing. And that also means that if we just change our message back here, what we can do is we can actually update such a value in a variable. So let's say, for example, we are going to change our message here, and we can say hello Python crash course reader, like this. And then we are printing this out again using message. And let's run our code again. And now you can see we have 2 lines of code being printed out. Hello Python world, which is the initial message here, and then hello Python crash course reader, which is the second message here. So we were always able to update those values here, and those variables basically refer to those particular labels assigned to those variables at this certain point in time. So let's take a quick look at some of the exercises here. The first one is to take a simple message, assign a message to a variable, and then print that message. And the second exercise here is to assign a message to a variable, print that message, and then to change the value of the variable to a new message and print that new message. So let's go back to Sublime Text, and we can just go to File, New File, and then save that under a certain name in the same folder that we used last time. So we could say we're going to call this simple message. Always important to end it in .py to tell Sublime that this is actually a Python file. And then we can call this message our message. We can go ahead and print that here, writing message like this. And then let's run it, and we can see we actually get this back here. So we saved our message properly. Now next, let's create an additional file. And let's save that again. And we can just call it another message, for example. And now we can start again. Our message might be hello there. And of course, instead of calling a message, we could call it something else, maybe value. So we can say print value, and then we should update it. This is updated. And then we can print value again. And if we run that now, we can see we actually updated this here. So we now have those 2 print statements here. So let's continue with taking a closer look at strings. So in Python, we have different kind of data types that we can work with, and strings are one of them. And a string is basically just a series of character that we are using. Anything inside of double or single quotes is considered a string in Python. So for example, this example here, this is a string with double quotes, and this is also a string inside of single quotes. Both are considered strings. So there are different kinds of methods or functions we can use in order to make changes to a string. So here's a simple example. We can use the title method, and let's actually do that, and let's create a separate file and save it under name.py. And so the name should either not less like this. And then we can use our print statement, and of course we could just print out the name like this. But now you can see it's an all lowercase. If instead we type .title, you can see now the initial character of each of the words is basically written in uppercase. So we capitalize basically the word we pass to it. So that's an example of a method that we can use on a string. So a method is basically an action that Python can perform on a piece of data, and the dot after the name means basically that Python is acting on that particular variable, so name in our example. So the title method changes each word to title case, which means uppercase, where each word begins with a capital letter. And that can be very useful if we have some data that is all mixed up with upper and lowercase letters, then we can just call title on it to basically change that. But there are additional methods that we can use. So for example, we could build on top of that and say print name.lower. And now we can see it's back in all lowercase. And if instead we then call name.upper on it and run that, we can see it's in all uppercase. So these are some helpful methods we can use when working with strings. So in some situations it can be really helpful to use some variables inside of strings. And for that, Python has a very helpful syntax. So let's just create a new file. And we can call it fullname.py. And here we can define, for example, a first name and then a last name as a variable, like this. And now we can go ahead and basically print out something. And of course we can just write hello Ada, for example, or Ada Loveless, like this. Nice to meet you. And we could run this again, and this is gonna print it out. But of course, if we wanted to change the first name and last name, for example, and we want to update that inside of our string, then we would always have to change it in two places, up here and then also inside of the string. And there's a much easier way to do that. We can basically add an F in front of the string, which turns it into an F string. And then we can go ahead and use those curly braces here. And inside of it, write our variable name. So for example, first name, last name. And now if we run that again, you can see the output is the same. But now if we change the value here, you can see the string here is updated and it uses the updated variable names. So that's a very handy way to print out some string and to dynamically basically replace the content here with the variables that we defined. And there used to be a different way of writing that prior to Python 3.6. Here's an example. We had to use the format method and basically pass the first name and last name or our variables to it. And then inside of the string here, we have to use those empty curly braces. But the new syntax is a lot easier to use and is used in all current versions of Python, so 3.6 and later. So if we are working with strings, sometimes we may have some white space in there. That can happen, for example, if we are working with some user input, for example, on a website, when a user provides their username or their password or something like that, they may accidentally add some white space in there, and we may not want to have that, for example, in a username. And to deal with that, Python has some very handy methods to remove that. So let's say, for example, we have a variable, let's just call it favorite language, which of course is Python. And let's say by accident someone added some white space here at the end. Now, in order to remove that, what we can do is we can basically print favorite language and then call rstrip on it, which will remove white space from the right side of the Python variable. So this is going to remove the white space on the right side. If instead we have something like this, so maybe other language, and we say we have C, we have white space on the left side, then we can go ahead and use lstrip, which is going to remove the white space on the left side of it. So that's how we can strip it from the left side, and rstrip would be used to remove it from the right side. And important to mention here is if we just type favorite language.rstrip, it's not permanently going to remove that white space. If we want to do that, then we need to store that change back in our variable. So here what we can do is the following. Instead of basically writing out print favorite language rstrip, instead we can say favorite language is equal to favorite language.rstrip. So this is going to remove the white space on the right side of favorite language, and it's going to store it back in favorite language. We are always reading the statement from the right side to the left side. So we first do the rstrip operation on favorite language on our string, and the result of that will be stored back in favorite language here. So that's how we can deal with that. One important note, when we are working with strings, there are a couple of things we need to pay attention to. Since we can use both double and single quoted strings like this, both would work, we need to make sure that we are consistent though. So what we cannot do is we cannot open a string with double quotes and then close it with single quotes. You can see we already get a red error bar here. And if I try to run that, we get the error that the end of line is not working properly because it's actually looking for another double quote to close our string. So if we add that in here, then that runs properly, but it's going to print out our single quote here. So we always need to make sure that we open it with double quotes and we close a string with double quotes if we do that, or we have to use single quotes and single quotes. And also, especially as we use single quotes, we need to be a little bit careful. So if we have a string like this, hello there, it's warm today, and then we close it with a single string, again we get an error here because now the single quote here, the apostrophe, is basically used as the end of the string. So again we get an invalid error syntax. And to deal with this, we can basically add a backslash here, which is going to escape that apostrophe, that single quote here, and then it's printed out properly. Or what's often easier in such a case here, we can of course go ahead and simply use double quotes like this, and this is then properly going to run. So whenever we have apostrophes or anything like that, then we can use double quotes and just print that in there. Alternatively, if we want to use quotation marks, maybe double quotes inside of a string, what we could do of course is we could either escape them, so by using the backslash character followed by the double quotes, or we could use single quotes outside of the string and then inside of the string use double quotes. Both would work properly. So let's take a quick look at some of the exercises here regarding strings and also variables. First of all, we should write a personal message. So use a variable to represent a person's name and then print a message to that person. Your message should be simple, such as, hello Eric, would you like to learn some Python today? So let's create a new file for that. And we can just call it exercise variables strings.py. So here we write the name Eric and then the print statement using the f string. So inside of our string we can just use a variable name in this case, to print Eric. Like this, and then we can run this, and now we can see, as we saw before, we basically replace that variable here with Eric as a variable name. Next, name cases. Use a variable to represent a person's name and then print that person's name in lowercase, uppercase and title case. So we already have our variable here. We can go ahead and print the name. Let's just print it regular, and then we can say we want to print it in lowercase, like this. We want to print it in uppercase, and we want to print it in title case. So let's run that, and here we can see we have the regular name Eric, then all lowercase, all uppercase and title case. Title case we don't really see, but if you just make a small change like this for instance, and we run that again, we can now see that Eric here is spelled with a capital I in the regular variable, and then here using title it actually removed that and just capitalized the first letter, and the rest is in all lowercase. So, famous quote: find a quote from a famous person you admire, print the quote and the name of the author. The output should look something like that in the following quote. So Albert Einstein once said, a person who never made a mistake never tried anything new. So we could say we have quote person, for example, and let's take Albert Einstein, and then quote message, for example, is the second variable. Never try anything new, like this. Okay, and then we can go ahead and print that out. So we can say we're going to use our print f method again, so we can use quote person once set, like this, and then we can add the quote message like this. And just to actually make the quotes show up, we can escape quotation signs here, so backslash quotation, and then we can see here Albert Einstein once said, a person who never made a mistake never tried anything new. So this is how we can accomplish that. And the next exercise we already kind of did. So here in the previous exercise we could have just basically pasted in here the quote or the text itself, and now we want to use a variable to accomplish that. So famous person as a variable name for the person and message for the message. So we could just update our variable name. So let's say instead of quote we say famous person, and here we call that message. And then of course we need to make sure to actually copy that over. Let's run it again. It's still working just as before. So next let's strip some white space from some names. So here we can create name white space. Let's just call it like that. And then we can go ahead and have, for example, Eric here, like this. And now we can go ahead and we can split the white space using rstrip to remove the right side of it. And then we can go ahead and remove the left side white spaces here using lstrip. And there's a very handy way to basically remove all the white space on the right, left, wherever this is. That is just called strip. So these are the three options here, and then we can run that, and basically the white space will then be removed. So here we can see Eric, we are first removing the white spaces on the right side, but not on the left side, which is why we still have the white space here. Next we are removing it from the left side, but not from the right side. And then we are using strip, which removes it both from the left side and the right side of our string. So let's continue with numbers, and numbers are used quite often inside of Python. We have, when we work with integers, so whole numbers, a number of different operations we can use. We can use add, subtract, multiply, and divide inside of Python, and that works quite easy. We can, for example, open a terminal window here, and then inside of the terminal window, of course, just start Python by typing in Python 3. And now we can just add numbers, we can multiply them, we can subtract them, and we can also divide them. So just as you would expect, we can do these kind of operations. And we can also use parentheses. So let's say, for example, we want to add two numbers first before multiplying that. That's of course also possible. So this is what we can do with general integer numbers. These are whole numbers, but of course we can also work with decimal numbers, with floats. And floats are basically any kind of number that has a decimal point in it. So if we take a look at working with integers, if for example we divide the integer 10 by the integer 2, we press enter, we can see that we actually get a float back. So this is now a float number. It has a decimal point in it, so it's 5.0. So whenever we divide integers, we need to be careful, because what we get back is basically a float that we are working with. And we can do the same kind of operations here. So for example, we can add different floating point numbers, we can multiply them. So let's just take an example of that. We can, for example, add 0.1 to 0.1, and we can also multiply that. One thing we have to be careful of though is what you see right here. When we multiply, for example, floating point numbers, or when we divide them, we can get back something that's not exactly right, so it's rounded. So we need to be a little bit careful when we do some mathematical operations with floating point numbers here. And we can also go ahead and combine integers and floats. So for example, as we saw before, when we divide two integers, we get back a floating point number. And also when we add an integer and a floating point number, it's always using the more precise measurement, so it would return back a float in this case. In order to structure big numbers a little bit more easily, we can also use underscores. So here, for example, if we have such a large number, for example 14 billion, we can separate those digits out by using an underscore, working with that. And what's quite handy is we can use multiple assignments. So if we have a number of different variables, for example x, y, and z, and we all want to set them to different values or to the same value in one line, we can do that. instead of writing out something like this here, x equals 0, y equals 0, z equals 0, that would still work, but it takes 3 lines. So instead of doing that, we could do the following. We can just separate them using a comma and then assign them to the appropriate values. And then of course we can still print them out. So if you want to print out x, you can see we get back 0. But we always need to make sure that we assign the right number of arguments here. So for our 3 variables, we need to make sure that we actually assign 3 different values to it, or 3 values to it. So if we did something like this, we try to only assign 2 values to those 3 variables. We try to run that, we actually get back an error because it doesn't know how to properly match those 2 values to those 3 variables here. So that's just something to pay attention to. But that can be a shorthand that's quite handy when we want to assign multiple values. So we learned about variables. There is another concept that's quite handy, and those are constants. So constants are basically variables that should not change and that should stay the same. And the convention is that constants should be written in all capital letters. So for example, here we have max_connections 5000, which basically means that this value is a constant. It should not be changed during the lifetime of the program that we're writing. So there are a couple of quick exercises here. We should write addition, subtraction, multiplication and division operations that each result in the number 8. So we can go ahead and just run it in the terminal, for example. So we could say 5 plus 3 equals 8. Then we could say 11 minus 3, for example, returns 8. So these are some ways of how we can accomplish that. So the next exercise here is favorite numbers. Use a variable to represent your favorite number. Then using that variable, create a message that reveals your favorite number. Print that message. So here, to do that, let's just write favorite number. And then we can print a message using our f string, for example, and say my favorite number is, and inside of the curly braces we then print out the favorite number. We can run that, and that of course is going to print that out. Now finally, let's learn about comments. Comments can be very useful to actually provide a little bit of context for our code that we are writing. And in order to write a comment, we just add the hash sign here, followed by some text. And whatever comes after the hash sign here is actually ignored by the Python interpreter. So it doesn't make any difference if we have a comment or not for a Python interpreter, but for us to read our code, that can be very useful. So here we can say, for example, what we do here is we print out our favorite number. And since we added the hash sign here, that is a comment. And as we run our code, that still works exactly the same. The Python interpreter completely ignores this, but for us it can be helpful just to give a little bit more context, some explanation of what we actually try to accomplish with our code. And we should be careful not to write some very obvious comments. In a lot of cases, our code is self-explanatory, but rather we should focus on why we do something the way we do, or what's the overall goal, so a little bit higher level. So we just did this exercise here. We basically added a comment here using the hash sign and then ran it. So let's briefly talk about the Zen of Python. The Zen of Python, or the idea of Python, is really to have very simple, very clear code that's transparent for everybody. And there's a small little module that we can actually use to learn more about this. So what we can do inside of our terminal is we can run import this. Let's do that real quick. We can open our terminal, and inside of the Python interpreter we say import this, and here we see the Zen of Python by Tim Peters. Beautiful is better than ugly, explicit is better than implicit, simple is better than complex, complex is better than complicated, and so on and so forth. So this is really what Python represents. We should make sure that we write very simple, very clear code, that we make it explicit what we want to accomplish, and then also, especially if we work on a project with other people together, that it's very transparent and clear what we try to accomplish. We learned how to work with variables in Python, how to name them properly, and also how to deal with name and syntax errors. We also covered strings and learned about some common string methods such as lower, upper, and how to remove white space from strings. We also covered numbers and comments in Python. In the next episode, we're going to focus on data structures, specifically lists. If you found this video helpful, please leave a like down below, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section down below. See you guys in the next video.